It was this morning, so Ken, if you did need more time to look into it, I would certainly understand, and I am sorry for the late notice there. Kind of might you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's absolutely, administrative costs are an allowable expenditure of the grant. And so there's a few different ways you could go about doing that. You can do it as a vendor type agreement, which is like how we're running it with your cities and towns, where we're administering it. We're not a subrecipient. We're a contractor who's just charging just the admin costs. So you can do it that same type of way. You could also do a subrecipient type agreement with another entity who would then divvy it out from there. My recommendation would be to stick to more of the vendor type agreement than a subrecipient type agreement. It's just fewer layers to go into, because then they would be also doing subrecipient below, and so that just gets more and more complicated. But you can certainly, that is certainly allowable use of the funds, and if you're going to allocate some of your direct funds to non-cities or towns, to other entities, it can be administered through a similar type program. We can also set them up in the portal, have their own logins, run it through that same type of process that we're currently doing with the cities and towns. Still would want a grant agreement, still would want the risk assessments that we're doing done. They would still do their reporting through the portal. So I think we just treat it like another entity, similar to what you're doing with your cities and towns.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
That's the only question that I recall as being outstanding, and I watched the meeting back. Are there others that the committee might have? While we have our colleague from CLA here.
No, I don't see it this morning. As we discussed last week, there may be questions that come up during the meeting, so we will record those questions, send them to CLA, and CLA will be with us at every meeting to report back on any outstanding questions that we have. So Thank you very much, Hannah. Which Great. Allows us to move on to number 4 on the agenda, which is Jared. Jared Knowles has joined us again this morning and will be joining us for the next couple of meetings coming up from Civilytics. And this morning he's going to discuss what the state has done with ARPA funds and give us sort of an overview of that. So we had the feds a couple of weeks ago. We'll have the state this morning. So at that point, I will turn it over to Jared.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I will share my slides and we will talk about the actions taken by the Commonwealth on this so far. Just get my window set up here. Great. So yeah, as we discussed in the my first presentation, there's the kind of very complicated, multifaceted layers of ARPA funding, and one of them that we discussed was the fact that the Commonwealth gets a large share of ARPA funds, which it can use to deploy both to cities, counties, and to regional and state challenges. And so we wanted to kind of get a handle on what the state has already said it's going to do with its ARPA allocations, so that you have a better sense of what additional money or resources might be available in Barnstable County to meet your challenges that the Commonwealth has laid out. So there's 2 large state appropriations that affected ARPA funds that I'm going to review. We'll talk first about very specific earmarks in both of those spending bills that were set aside for Barnstable County or municipality therein. And then we'll talk about the larger, fuzzier statewide investments that those bills made, which will be trickling out through the administration of a variety of grant programs, existing and new programs. And we'll talk and highlight some of the specific programs and what we know about them at this time. And again, this is really to give you a sense both of the magnitude, so you can think about what resources might be available to meet the county's challenges, and to lay the landscape for when those opportunities might become available for the timeline and the timing of that funding. So then we'll have time for questions. And this will also be a bit of a preview for our final discussion, which will be looking at the amounts that municipalities have received from different funding streams and what they've reported that they're planning to do with some of that funding. So we'll get into a little bit of that here too, just because of the nature of the spending. So the two bills we're talking about, Massachusetts was one of the states that took a deliberate approach with ARPA. So the first ARPA spending bill wasn't passed until December of 2021. And the second one was passed in April of 2022. And that they included a mixture of ARPA spending and state surplus spending from the general fund. So it's not entirely all ARPA funding. They've mixed those two things together. But I'm going to treat them as money that, these are the state actions that are taken regarding ARPA. So let's talk about what's in these. So within these, I should say, so, it's about, we're looking at about $4.8 billion of spending authorized in these two bills over the next few years. And so let's look at that. So 4.8 billion is what the Commonwealth is going to put out across the Commonwealth. Let's look at the specific earmarks that are in the legislation for municipalities and the county. So here's 19.95 million earmarked across the two bills. So 4.8 billion total spending. There's not a lot of earmarking going on. Not a lot of earmarking specifically to the county, but here's what it is. So Bourne is going to get 10 million for an offshore wind workforce training program at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy. That's obviously more than half of the total amount of earmarks to the county. So that's important to keep in mind. Wellfleet is getting $2.7 million for its wastewater treatment facility on 95 Lawrence Road. Sandwich is getting $1.3 million for rehabilitation and expansion of the Shawnee Powell campground and a new generator for the Sandwich Trout Hatchery. And downtown recovery grants, which is a big initiative of the governor, will be given to Barnstable, Falmouth, Yarmouth, and smaller amounts to the other towns in the county. So these are grants to help promote business and bring businesses back to the downtown area and to make the downtowns of municipalities in the Commonwealth, revitalized. And so these are kind of proportional to the populations of these communities. So those are the set asides directly. So that's money that's definitely going to Cape Cod. Is there a question?
I have just two questions, Jared. On your first slide, when you showed the two distributions from the state, and also, but some of the total amounts you showed from the state surplus, the 1.4 from the state surplus and the 1.2 in capital authorizations, those are not ARPA funds, but are those included in the 2.5 billion, or are those in addition to?
They're in addition to.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
And Jared, may I ask you a question? If
Yes.
they're amplifying the ARPA funds, the restrictions relative to ARPA funds would not apply to the funds from other sources, correct?
Right. So if their 1.45 billion that the state spends from its surplus, it can spend on whatever it wants, and it doesn't have to adhere to the ARPA restrictions. Any other questions before we move on from the earmarks section of the spending? Okay, great.
Yeah.
So another big part of the program, of this spending program, is initiatives around affordable housing. We'll talk more about the broader Commonwealth initiatives for affordable housing, but these are earmarks specifically for Barnstable County housing. So there's a $3.25 million to the Housing Assistance Corporation to construct housing projects in Cape Cod and address affordable housing in Cape Cod. So that includes 2 housing projects in Orleans and Bourne, which will provide 56 affordable housing units, 2-year accessory dwelling unit build out incentive program, a 2-year rental subsidy and financial coaching pilot for employees of early education providers and providers of services to developmentally disabled individuals to help them get housing on the Cape, and convening a Cape Cod and Islands Housing Advocacy Coalition to advance housing production. So that's going to happen through this spending from the Commonwealth. There's $1 million to the Homeless Prevention Council and Community Development Partnership to support the unique regional housing and year-round resident needs on the Lower and Outer Cape, and $250,000 to the Cape Cod Commission to identify properties in Barnstable County for potential housing development and study the associated tasks. So that's more of a planning and study, not including really resources to do the construction or to do the housing developments themselves. So those are also specific earmarks set aside for Barnstable County under the spending programs. You don't have to apply for them. These are things that the Commonwealth is going to do. And you have a copy of the slide, so you don't have to write down hopefully all of these little details, but wanted to put those details for you. There's some other earmarks for Barnstable County that are smaller, but still important. $500,000 to Outer Cape Health Services for a structured outpatient addiction program, $400,000 to the Arts Foundation, $110,000 to Amplify POC Cape Cod, $100,000 to the Cape Cod Regional, $100,000 to the Duffy Health Center, and then $50,000 to $80,000 grants for all of these smaller programs in smaller font here, a variety of smaller community-based organizations on the Cape. So this is also spending from the Commonwealth that's coming directly to entities on the Cape that can administer programs. So that ends that's like the regional earmarks. We did municipalities. These are more regional or working across the area earmarks. And now I want to talk about the Commonwealth's plans for the bulk of the money, because as we could see, the earmark portion is small relative to the total spending that the two bills authorize. So this is how the spending is going to break down for statewide investments. This is a table that breaks down the investments in order of magnitude by category. A lot of the other spending, you'll see that this doesn't total to the total amount. A lot of the other spending is for infrastructure spending or school spending, and we can talk about that separately. But for health and human services, they're going to spend $930 million, environments $676 million, housing $452 million, commerce, which is mostly about broadband, we'll see, or commerce, which is mostly about the revitalization grants and some development grants, is $131 million. Then water and sewer is $100 million, and then it goes down from there. But I want to focus on them in one at a time. So health and human services is the $930 million. And the priorities of this spending include local and regional public health systems. So this could include some of the public health systems that got earmarks. They could also get funding through this. Fiscally strained hospitals, capital improvements and workforce recruitment and retention at skilled nursing facilities, community-based care programs, and services for children with behavioral health needs. So in this block of funding, there's not funding that's guaranteed for Barnstable County, but it's funding sources or existing programs the Commonwealth runs that do contribute to the operations of health and human services entities on the Cape already. So this is, so that there's opportunities to get some of this funding for sure. Some of it will be competitive and some of it will be formula based. Some of the details of those agencies that are going to be dispersing the funds are still working through those details. So we don't have a lot of information on the way these programs are actually going to be administered quite yet, and whether they'll just be doing existing programs more or creating new programs. In some cases we do, and I'll point those out where we can. For the environment, there's going to be grants for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from building sector and transportation sector, clean energy technology and innovations. A lot of that, for example, is for the offshore wind programs. And we saw that even the Barnstable County, there's going to be the $10 million for the training academy for that as well. Publicly owned lands and lands conserved for public access will have funds to support their them, and then restoration of coastal areas, aquatic ecosystems, mitigation of threats from climate change. So some of this is more money going through similar channels to the water funds that we talked about under the ARPA regulations. So some of this is the Commonwealth contributing funds to that, and some of this will be new grant programs administered by the Energy Department or the Environment Department to talk about, to make specific policy changes. That will depend on the agency's existing programs and what they want to do in each of these agencies. But since, like we kind of talked about at the last meeting, ARPA was sort of a unique opportunity to address housing because the infrastructure bill didn't say anything about housing, and you all wanted to address housing, and housing is the primary issue that are in people's minds. So what is the Commonwealth going to be doing about housing? Of its $452 million in affordable housing investments, $150 million is going to go toward developing temporary and permanent housing for chronically homeless individuals and families, $115 million to produce affordable rental housing. And here, the state is being more flexible than, for example, programs administered by the Department of the HUD at the federal level, because here the Commonwealth is also interested in producing mid-level, mid-expense, the gap between, low-income housing and regular non-subsidized housing. There's a gap that occurs in Massachusetts because of the high cost of living in Massachusetts, where funding is not really eligible for low-income housing, but people still struggle to make their housing payments. And so that is something unique that the Commonwealth is using its funds for. Another $115 million for housing production efforts through the Commonwealth Builder Program. And that's something that can be regional planning organization, cities or counties can apply with to come up with development plans to do that, to build out those housing developments. $65 million for homeownership incentive programs, down payment assistance programs, mortgage insurance programs, and mortgage interest subsidy programs. So these would be housing programs that sometimes our municipalities already have them, where the municipality can take on part of individual's mortgage. The municipality can offset the cost of the interest on the mortgage. So this is a way to help people become first-time homeowners and to own permanent housing in ways that are otherwise not affordable. Again, HUD has programs like this too, but they're very income restricted. And so this, the intention of this Commonwealth funding, I think, is to, broaden the availability of these programs outside of some of the federal restrictions. And then there's a $6.5 million pilot program to retrofit low-income housing and moderate-income housing to make it either more efficient, and to bring it up, increase the quality of these housing programs. So here there's a lot of innovation and new investment around housing that's happening in the Commonwealth. And I'll pause here to see if there are questions, because I know housing is really a critical one on the committee's mind.
Just one. You mentioned an important fact that these housing requirements are less restrictive as they relate to income. Do we know what the percentage of AMI is that they will allow these loans to go up to?
I looked at the Commonwealth Builder Program, and I don't want to comment off the top of my head. So why don't I make a note, and I will get the exact specifics, and I'll put it in the chat at the end. But I found at least for now, the Commonwealth Builder Program, there's a sheet that was put out by Mass Housing that explains exactly the AMI subsidy schedule that they have in mind.
Great, thank you.
And Jared, just a question relative to the availability of the programs. For example, the $65 million for the home ownership incentive programs. Is there and I know you touched on this, but will communities compete competitively for these state funds, or is it anticipated that there will be statewide programs that individuals can apply to?
I will double check on that for you because I think it's a good question. I feel like I read something that this will be like municipalities will apply to say we'd like to establish one of these programs. And I don't know how competitive they'll be, but let me double check on that for you as well, just to be sure.
I don't see any other problems.
So that's what we have for the housing. The next one I wanted to talk about is things that, this program, the commerce section could also support a lot of workforce development and workforce retention, and labor shortages are also something that's really an important challenge communities are facing right now. So this includes funding for Community One Stop for Growth. That is a sort of streamlined application process for a variety of competitive funding provided by the Department of Commerce. It's probably a process that the county has engaged with at least in the last few years. And municipalities are engaged with that process. So this just puts more funding on the table for that streamlined application process. It funds the Future of Work initiatives by the Labor Department, the Hire Now initiative, and supporting and developing municipal public employees, agricultural, commercial fishing, and cranberry growing industry subsidies and supports, and regional tourism promotion supports. So some of these are programs to subsidize or provide grants to industry, to commercial entities. So there wouldn't be things the county would specifically be eligible for, but the cranberry industry, obviously on the Cape, would be eligible to get funding through these programs or to apply for opportunities through this. And the regional tourism promotion would be something that is probably something the county is engaged in conversations with the state about how to promote tourism. And so I think this is just providing more funding to support those efforts and get people to come back and visit. So those are the Community One Stop for Growth application and process. It seems like it received a big increase through this funding program to make it more encompassing and to put more funding on the table for that. So that's I think the big one to keep an eye on strategically for the next few years, because that's something the county and its municipalities are both eligible to apply for, as well as housing development could also be potentially applied for through that as well.
Jared, may I ask you a question? Sorry to keep peppering you with them.
No, that's great. That's what we're here for.
Okay, and that is, I noted that Hire Now is not accepting any pre-registrations for employers. So relative to the timing of the deployment of these funds, have these been committed and yet not yet dispersed?
Yeah, I mean, the second bill only passed in April, and the first one passed in December of 2021. So there's a lot of work these funds have been committed. They're appropriated to the agencies that are going to be administering them, but I'm not surprised a lot of them are not ready to go. That's why a lot of the information we have doesn't even have links to the new programs yet, because they haven't put up a website describing the rules of the program quite yet, or the intention. So this is one of those things that, like we talked about with ARPA a little bit, with the infrastructure bill, where there's a monitoring cost to the county to keep an eye out on these programs and find out when they become eligible to take advantage of them in an ongoing way. Then, like I mentioned, for the water and sewer, it's 101 million additional dollars through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So those revolving funds are really important for your water questions on the Cape, because the infrastructure bill is flowing into the money from the infrastructure bill will flow through there for the next few years, like we discussed. The state has allocated money to it here in these two spending bills. How the rules and priorities of that will be governing those two revolving funds are going to, there's going to be more available resources through that channel than historically. And so that will be an opportunity, but there's not a separate, this is the vehicle that's being used to disperse the money for clean water and drinking water. And it seems like everyone kind of agrees that that's going to continue to be the vehicle to put that money through both the Commonwealth and the federal government. Yeah, we talked a lot about broadband last time. So the Commonwealth has committed $50 million to facilitate broadband internet access in these two spending bills. Are there any other questions? And again, I'll answer the questions that were previously posed. I'll do a quick little research and put them in the chat. But if there are any other questions, please do log them now with me, and I'll make sure to get you an answer.
I don't see.
Sean,
Oh, Karen has a question.
Karen. Sean had a
Oh, Sean.
that's for.
Sean, go right ahead, Sean.
Hello, everybody. Apologize for the tardy. As it relates to the broadband funds of 50 million, first I should say that in comparison to other states, this is embarrassingly anemic, and it's way out of whack compared to what other states are spending on their rescue plan money for broadband. But do you know, my understanding that 50 million portions of it, I mean, it are related to broadband adoption and devices and things of that nature. And I don't think really any of this money is for deploying new networks, is my understanding. Is that your basic understanding? I mean, 55 million to build a network in Falmouth is more than they're even allotting for the entire.
Yeah, and I think your point is right, that even if it was all for building a network in the Commonwealth, how many miles of fiber would we be able to get out of it, and how much of it would even go to Cape Cod? A lot of it is for device and setting up subsidy programs for access, and not solving the networking problem or increasing the technical capabilities of the network. Right.
Got it. Yeah. It seems the state's posture is that they're satisfied with the monopoly.
Yes, they don't want to upset the monopoly. Just continue to make sure that the money goes out for the same sort of subsidies that were set up under the CARES 19 Act and other things. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Great, Karen.
Excuse me, not so much a question, but more of a comment, just in the spirit of full transparency. Health centers early on did receive a significant amount of money, probably about $4 million through ARPA funding early on. And most recently, I think, and I'm not sure that first is represented here. And then, yep, and that, okay, perfect. And then,
You asked, someone asked this last time, so I made this slide to track down where the original ARPA allocation to the health centers was and how much it was, and this is what I found. So I'm glad you brought this up, because it is follow-up that we had followed up on last time.
just again, in full transparency, and then as part of the 930 million, there is a portion of that'll come back to the county. It's out for bid now.
Great, thank you. Kristen.
Also in full transparency, and I was kind of waiting to see where this might end up, but Jared, we're the community foundation for Barnstable County. So we're one of the 13 community foundations that received CDBG funding through DHCD for food access and food security. So I don't know where that falls, but that we received a little over will receive a little over 1.3 million for Barnstable County. So I just want to make sure that that's represented somewhere and people are aware of that.
And then Harbor isn't represented here, but because their home office is Boston, but they're on this list also.
Great.
Or they should be on the list.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Jared based on the state presentation today? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much for that presentation, Jared. It's very informative. So we're going to partner that up with the what we know about the federal transactions to date around ARPA and move forward. There are no other questions. I think we're ready to move on in the agenda. So the fifth item on our agenda today is the discussion of regional challenges. As we discussed at the last meeting, we identified 6 regional challenges, and we're going to step through them over the next 3 meetings, 2 at a time. And we decided that we would lead with housing and water quality. Christie Senatori and the Cape Cod Commission have been kind enough to work up these 2 2-page documents, which I think give us a brief overview and some of the salient facts associated with each issue. So I think we will take them one at a time. And I've asked Christie to just give us a run through on the 1-pager that we will have in front of us. We'll be able to ask questions on that, and then hopefully have a group discussion, be able to summarize some of the challenges as we see them. So we can start with regional housing. And I'll turn it over to Christie.
Great. Good morning. It is nice to see you all. So last time I was speaking to the group, I think it was your very first meeting, and we talked more broadly about some of the challenges facing the region. So this is a good opportunity now to dive in a little bit more into the detail and the data to really kind of set the stage and really provide some background context for some of these regional challenges and how the group, the committee might make some recommendations moving forward. So what you have in front of you are just a couple of data sheets, so some 1-pagers that provide a lot of the context and information. And I'm just going to walk through some of that in a series of slides, and then feel free to jump in and ask some questions as we go along. So we all know affordable, attainable housing is getting further out of reach. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that our housing stock is primarily single family homes. We have very little differing types of homes on the market. And certainly in the region, 82% of our homes are detached single family. And if you compare that to the rest of the state and even the rest of the country, we're significantly higher than both the state and the rest of the country. Our price of housing is high. It's only been increasing over the course of the past several years, and certainly we've seen that during the pandemic as well. The median single family home price in 2018 was about $425,000. The median single family home price in 2021 was almost $620,000. Those prices are continuing to increase into 2022. And at the same time, our wages are not keeping up. So the average annual wages in our top 3 employment industries are falling far from the estimated income that's needed for home ownership. So here what you can see is the 2020 median household income in the region was about $77,000. The annual household income needed to afford that median single family home in 2020 was nearly $120,000. Along the bottom there, you can see those top industries are accommodation and food services, retail trade, and healthcare, certainly not keeping up with the income needed to afford that single family home. This here. And so we're also seeing that the gap between housing prices and wages is widening. Certainly housing prices have increased dramatically, and about a 41.2% housing price increase since June of 2019, but our average weekly wages have only increased by about 14%. So the gap is widening, and certainly that's only exacerbating the issue. And we need to talk about rental opportunities at the same time. So if we look at year-round rental housing, we know it's limited in the region, and a lot of property owners are seeing a higher rate of return on short-term seasonal rentals. So if you compare, again, the Cape to the Commonwealth and the rest of the country, we're at about 20% year-round rental opportunities, whereas the state's about 38% and the country is about 36%. And we hear, even anecdotally, but certainly Housing Assistance Corporation has produced some reports recently where we know we've got less than a 1% vacancy rate for year-round rentals. 7% is the number that's considered in a healthy market. And then, of course, we have a seasonal multiplier. So seasonal housing is obviously prevalent in the region. Almost 38% of the housing is seasonal on the Cape compared to the rest of the Commonwealth and the country. And when we issued a homeowner survey to the Cape Cod Second homeowners last year, we did find that less than 4% of the second homeowners indicated that they'd be interested in renting their house year round. So definitely is an interesting fact when we're looking at the housing market here in the region. And then we need to look at housing supply. So the inventory of homes for sale has steeply declined during the pandemic. Here you can see in 2017, there were about 1,900 homes on the market, saw a slight increase in 2018, and then such a drastic decrease over the course of the past several years, with only 388 homes on the market at a point in time in 2021. At the same time, we're also seeing a lack of housing production. And this is kind of a new data point that we're focusing in on. As we can see, over the course of the past 10 or so years, only about 2.5% of the county's housing supply has been constructed, compared to the Commonwealth at about 4%, and the rest of the country is developing at about 6.2%. And of course, we want to make sure that we're also incorporating data on homelessness. And this is the number of homeless persons counted annually by the Cape and Islands Regional Network on Homelessness. And we did see an increase of about 54 homeless individuals from 2021 to 2022. So you can see those numbers over the course of the past 10 years, but we know this is continuing to be an issue facing our population and contributing to our housing crisis. So some of the things that the Commission has already started to do, a lot of the planning work. We know we want to make sure that we can take action, we can put strategies into place to address our housing crisis. We've developed housing profiles for all 15 of our communities, as well as a regional housing profile that highlights for all 15 towns, as well as the region, some of the key demographic and economic information, wages, employment, and housing affordability, as well as some of the regulatory hurdles in the communities, as well as some of the strategies that are either already being considered or deployed. So this is something that will help us put together regional strategies, but also help the local communities as they're looking at potential opportunities. Zoning changes we know is going to be a significant component of addressing the housing crisis. And so Jared mentioned this briefly, but this is a regional housing suitability analysis. And as Jared mentioned, we did receive $250,000 to identify properties for potential development and, probably more importantly, redevelopment for housing. So this is an area where we're already underway with the development of this tool that will help us to identify areas where we may want to look at changing local zoning. We may want to look at incentivizing development of housing and really putting a strategy in place to work with the local communities on a regional plan. And so lastly, just wanted to kind of focus in a little bit on the regional housing strategy that we've got developed at the Commission. We're underway already with the baseline data collection and analysis. We've developed the town profiles. We're currently working with the UMass Donahue Institute on a needs assessment. A lot of the data that's out there currently is outdated, so we really need to get at the more specific numbers for need. We'll be working collaboratively and closely with stakeholders across the region. Obviously, the municipalities need to be engaged to look at the existing conditions and a lot of the housing preferences in the region. Even conversations I had up until this morning with different housing organizations, there's still discussions around what's suitable and what's preferable in some of our communities, and we need to continue to have the conversation around density. And then talking about challenges and solutions and how can we really put into place strategies that are going to work for our local communities. Residential design guidelines is also something I think we need to be looking at. Not only does this address one of those cross-cutting issues of climate change, but it's also an opportunity for us to work to make sure that the community design is also something that's is important to the region. And of course, providing this decision support tool that we can really let the communities have all the data and information and the tools at their disposal to make those informed decisions around where they might need to change zoning and how they can best go about doing that. So I'm going to pause here for just a moment and see if there's any questions on the housing piece of this, and I'll turn it back to Paul to have a discussion around this piece of it before we kind of dive into some of the water quality challenges.
Thank you, Christy. This is just an excellent sort of snapshot of where we are. But it does point out that we still have questions that we have to answer. So we're happy that the commission has 250 to do that. We want to support that effort. One of them is, so if we look at the, the median price of a single family home at 619, and a family that would have to make 120,000 to get into that market. And then we have the inventory discussion on the back. But if we just looked at the inventory of houses that were available at the median price of 619, it would be shockingly low. So there are connections still to be made between some of these data points here that are going to be, that are really going to underline the case for housing. But at this point, I'd like to open it up to the committee for questions or comments around housing. Karen.
So again, Christy, great job on that. I just a comment, and I'm focused a little bit more deliberately on healthcare. I do think that 63,000 is a little underrepresenting what we're dealing with, just because the disparities in income levels in healthcare and the fact that healthcare is such a big part of our market sector, really, that is a little bit high considering the entire numbers, even though we're looking at median. So it just drives home the priority and the real importance of housing as well.
Well said. Are there other questions on housing? Dorothy.
It's more of a comment and it's really stating the obvious, which is the super important work that the commission is doing is engaging stakeholders relative to this about desirability of location, design, and what the actual units end up being. Because as we know, it's not just residents that are competing for this extraordinarily limited inventory. It's also second homeowners. And so, what you have to be thoughtful about is not compounding the issue just by providing housing that is not going to be affordable by, residents, and therefore, creating that not so virtuous cycle. So again, I know I'm stating the obvious, but the work that Christy and the commission is doing in terms of the engagement here is just so critical, because it's going to take a meaningful strategy to understand how to navigate through that. Just throwing more supply isn't necessarily going to resolve the issue.
That's a great issue. I mean, unlike other parts of the country, we don't have the option just to build more houses in the desert. So we have to look at verticality, we have to look at redevelopment, but we also have to look at what makes us unique. And 38% of the housing stock are second homes. That's a market-driven force. That's not going to change. So even if we were to build more homes, it's likely that 40% of them would be purchased by second homeowners. So that's certainly an issue that we have to keep front of mind.
And if I may, just quoting a colleague of mine, the second homeowners are an important driver in our local economy. So it's not that we want to vilify them in any way, but you said it exactly right, which is understanding the market forces and therefore addressing a strategy that accommodates that, but still somehow accommodates, and obviously we're having conversations about the wage side as well as the pricing side, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is a really good point too. We do not want to villainize second homeowners in many ways. I believe that the percentage of second homes on the Cape has made us more economically resilient in times of trouble. So we don't want to get rid of that. So, but it forces us into a discussion if we can't build our way out of this, if we don't want to sort of demonize second homeowners, what are the approaches that could be taken? Some of it gets back to one of the first things on Christie's sheet here is the percentage of single-family homes that we have. So diversification of housing typology is probably a better strategy for the Cape to look at. And part of it would be land use strategies around if we were to create a different housing typology and additional density, could certain pockets of this be reserved for year-round residents? Could certain pockets of it be reserved for workforce? So I think those are the kind of issues that we need to discuss and sort of highlight for the commissioners. I can give you one example from the chamber's perspective is just sort of seasonal housing, well, the housing for the seasonal workforce. You know, we have 100,000 people that are employed year round, 25,000 additional jobs during peak season. Probably 8,000 of those used to come from foreign workers who were here, H-2B visas or J-1 visas. If we look at just the J-1s in 2018, 2019, we had 5,000 J-1 students here under the summer work travel program. There are only 100,000 visas nationally. So the state of California gets a little over 30% of those visas, and little old Cape Cod gets 5%. So it shows how dramatically reliant we are on that workforce. And that workforce that used to be 5,000 has only recovered to about 2,100 last year and this year, only about 40% of what we had. And part of the reason is that the sponsoring organizations are now asking employers to provide housing. And so they're directing people that used to come to the Cape to other parts of the country. So that's not a temporary COVID-19 problem. That's a permanent issue for us. And it means we've lost 3,000 people that were here as part of the seasonal workforce. You know, it's dramatic. It really is dramatic. I mean, there are housing issues everywhere, but the housing issue on this peninsula it is at a point where we're already seeing detrimental impacts on the economy, potentially, you know, as we move forward. So are there additional comments on housing? It's a big one. I see that there may not be a lot of comments on this, and I don't think we should read into that this isn't a priority. It's just a massive one. And it's going to require some creative thinking and some long-term thinking about how to solve it. So I know that early on we talked potentially about, you know, fencing off some resources to address certain challenges, especially if those challenges were, you know, near the top three. So this might be one of those areas that we want to consider that.
I just have a question for Christy. Just for the record, or just to get the information out, the regional housing strategy, you started it, you're partially through it, the beginning of it. What's the timeline for completion if you receive, you know, financial support to complete the entire thing?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Beth. So we are underway with collection of the baseline data and information. We're doing the needs analysis and the housing suitability analysis, and we've been trying to leverage other resources prior to kind of kicking off the stakeholder process and launching the overarching regional housing strategy. But we think this is something we could probably accomplish within an 8 to 12 months timeframe.
Excellent. Okay. So we've solved the housing problem. We're going to move on to water quality. Go ahead,
Okay.
Christy.
All right, great, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen again. Hopefully you can all see it if I can get back to it. Okay, so moving into coastal and freshwater quality, we've kind of combined the two, and I think they're probably equally important and probably equally important with our housing challenges as well. But wanted to start off by just kind of framing and again putting this into context where Cape Cod's coastal waters are impaired by excess nitrogen, and 79% of the region's land is discharging to one of 53 coastal embayments. So the land is really contributing, the land use and the development is really contributing to the degradation of our coastal water quality. And so if we look at watersheds, so 32 of our watersheds actually cross municipal boundaries. It's about 2/3 of the watersheds. And so this is, of course, not a town by town solution that we need to put into place here. Many of our communities are moving ahead, making progress, but this needs to be done regionally. And then if we look at those embayments, the embayment watersheds that require nitrogen removal, here you can see those significant embayments on the south side and some of those on the outer Cape as well that are requiring nitrogen removal. And 80% of our watershed load for nitrogen is actually coming from our on-site septic systems. Here you can see those areas shaded in the blue are those areas where we've got on-site septic systems, smaller areas where there's already some treatment, some sewered areas with some wastewater treatment facilities, but 80% of that is coming from our on-site septic systems. But as I mentioned, towns are taking action to improve coastal water quality. We have 11 towns across the Cape that have some type of a plan in place. 4 towns are in the planning phases, and we actually have 2 watershed intermunicipal agreements and 1 watershed permit. You can see those towns there contributing to the Pleasant Bay watershed that have the first ever watershed permit already in place. So we are seeing some progress. But there's been some success in bringing in some funding in the form of the Water Protection Fund to address coastal water quality. But we also want to make sure that there's an understanding that properly functioning ponds and lakes actually play an important role in preserving our coastal water quality as well. The 890 freshwater ponds that we have in the region are credited for reducing about half of the nitrogen that comes through them on their way to the coastal embayments. And many of our ponds are at risk, not only from pollutants from precipitation and groundwater, but stormwater as well, and in the way that they're recharged. So some of those nutrient impairments are certainly different than we're seeing in nitrogen. There's a lot of phosphorus and other types of nutrients that are impacting our freshwater quality as well. There is certainly an increasing concern and an increasing awareness for freshwater quality. We've got some documentation, and you're of course probably aware and have seen the harmful algal blooms. We've got increased nutrients and eutrophication and those high phosphorus levels. And here what you can see is those cyanobacteria advisories. They've been increasing, and certainly we've seen a significant increase since 2020, from 2020 to 2021. Those advisories that have been issued by our local health departments are certainly becoming more prevalent. And APCC recently issued a report where of the 87 ponds that they're monitoring for cyanobacteria, 40% of those have been graded as unacceptable. So certainly something that needs to be addressed. When we talk about data collection, though, there is limited available data, unfortunately, at this point to gather like a very clear understanding of our pond health. So we really need to focus on consistent and consecutive data collection to be able to put together some management and improvement strategies around our ponds. Only a small portion of our current ponds and lakes are actually monitored. It's less than 10%. And only 4% of those had sufficient water quality data to be able to grade our ponds in 2021. So here you can see the ponds that have been monitored in the past, and the number of ponds that have been monitored, and the quality of the data, water quality data that we do have has been declining, really kind of pointing to the need for a long-term plan. Many of these are actually sampled without quality assurance plans as well, or QAPs. So there certainly needs to be more focus on this consistent and consecutive data collection. Also contributing to that, the lack of sufficient quality control data is an underestimation of the ponds that are listed on DEP's 303D list. So this is a list of integrated waters that are impaired. But what we do know is that 24 ponds on the Cape are actually already listed in the highest category of concern on that list. So there are many ponds listed within the other categories within that 303D list, but there are 24 already within that highest category of concern. In many of our communities, many of our local pond groups have really asked for help. They need more monitoring, and they need to identify some of the strategies that can be used to really address some of the nutrient pollution that we're seeing. So they need more extensive monitoring, best practices they need to be identified, and really those strategies for pond restoration and protection. So we've designed the Freshwater Initiative as an opportunity for us to put a strategy in place. Really, it's a roadmap of sorts mirroring 208. So this is more than just a planning process, but really developing strategies and an implementation plan to addressing our freshwater lakes and ponds concerns and issues. So a couple of these things have already been completed and are underway towards completion. And the first of which is our Ponds and Lakes Atlas. So we just completed an update to the 2003 Ponds and Lakes Atlas, really serving as that baseline set of data and information. We also developed an online decision support tool to provide communities with the best available information and data around the ponds in each of the 15 communities and regionally. But many of the other components of that are listed here. I won't go into a lot of detail on these, but can certainly go into as much detail as you'd like. But remote sensing is something that we want to be able to use the best available technology. And so this is using satellite derived imagery and using existing pond water quality data to really evaluate changes in some of the pond characteristics that we're seeing. Data management and analysis, this kind of goes without saying, certainly something that we need to not only continue, but really identify opportunities to expand that monitoring program. And if we are able to take advantage of monitoring database that we already have in place for coastal water quality, and we can expand this to include our freshwater data as well, we can develop processing scripts and really be able to look at trends, and so provide that analysis of our coastal water quality as well as now our freshwater quality. Identifying physical characteristics of all of the ponds, and this is really going to help us determine some of the potential internal and external drivers of water quality degradation. Developing a strategies database so that this is something that we can then work with the different pond community groups, with the volunteers, with the municipalities, and with the stakeholders in the region to not only develop this database, but to develop an action plan. And some of these will be regulatory options. Some of these will be potential model bylaws that can be implemented at the local level, but some may be more aggressive strategies for protecting and restoring pond water quality. Engagement and outreach probably goes without saying, but similarly to the housing strategy, there needs to be significant stakeholder engagement so that we can identify those strategies and develop that framework for implementation. A piece of this that we're ready to go with immediately is the economic analysis. And so one of the first components of the initiative really needs to be looking at the economic piece of this. If we were to take no action as a region, what would that look like? What are the impacts of degraded freshwater on the regional economy? And then also take a look at some of the strategies that are developed and what are the economic costs and benefits to some of those pond management strategies. I think the legal and jurisdictional analysis is also probably one of the most critical elements to conduct initially. There are laws relative to public and private interests and access, and we need to make sure that that's identified up front before identifying strategies. Monitoring, of course, and that ongoing data management and analysis. So I have kind of gone through that quickly, but I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. But I think, again, happy to open this up to a broader dialogue. And I'll stop presenting my screen here, and I'll hand it back over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Christy. Another sort of excellent synopsis of a really important problem. We know that on the Cape, the environment is the economy. One question, though, the freshwater initiative page you showed at the end, is that something that's currently underway, or is that something that you've scoped out but still needs to be funded?
There are a couple of components within that initiative that we have moved forward with already, wanting to be able to set the baseline for information. And but for the most part, that freshwater initiative there's a fully defined scope of work for that and a budget associated with that. And so certainly we'd be looking to move that forward and in an expeditious way.
So one of the main things that we have to look here is a monitoring program, right? Because now it's basically somewhat ad hoc and a volunteer program, and people, use kayaks and they put a big red cup at the end of a yardstick, and that's what we have. So if we were to create this monitoring program long-term, is this something that could be housed at the county? And if so, is it sustainable? And how much would that cost? Or is that something that we need to look into?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it may be more than red solo cups, but it is a network of volunteers. And so that's really important to point out that this does rely on a network, and it relies on management of a network of volunteers and putting those quality assurance plans in place, those QAPs. And so those don't necessarily exist for all of the different parameters that need to be monitored. And so getting that information and that data in a format that's easily accessible or can be incorporated into the database and then fed back out to those that need that data and information is critical component of this too. I do think that there's an opportunity to potentially work with the county lab on some of the pond water quality sampling. And so that's something that we would further explore, whether that was part of an initial phase or if there was a ramp up of the equipment needed in the county lab, that could be explored as well. So, but we would want to make sure that this is a sustainable monitoring program. So working with potential outside partners as well, who are already doing the data collection to make sure that there is there's some commonalities amongst what's collected and how it's reported.
Great. Dan, so you have a question?
Yeah, just a suggestion I would have is that the nice thing about ponds and lakes on the Cape is they have built-in constituents already. And I think something that would be really, really helpful is to like have a kit of how to form a Friends of Pond, how to build coalitions around the ponds, because as far as getting resources, the people who are nearest to the ponds, A, they have an emotional connection, and B, they have a financial risk. And I just, it would be great if we actually had friends of all of these pond groups to talk to. And so maybe there's a way to do some like sort of political or neighborhood organizing around that.
Yeah, I
Great.
think that's a great suggestion. And I actually think we'll probably have more stakeholders engaged in freshwater than maybe we even did on looking at coastal water quality. I think there's that many people that want to be involved in these discussions. So I think putting some of that framework together is a great idea. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Yes, the politics of freshwater are very different than the politics of saltwater. Are there additional questions? Kristen, did you have a question? No? Okay. So I would want to note for the group, though, that a couple weeks ago, the governor filed a supplemental budget bill, and it had $200 million in it for Cape Cod water quality stuff. That could be split between the existing Water Protection Trust Fund, which are funding community efforts to sewer, and to the county's septic loan program, which has been modified and has the ability now to offset hookup costs, which were one of the big drawbacks. So making the decision about sewering versus maintaining Title V, not one that has a cost associated with it, a cost benefit, is a big step forward. But if we don't have a good ponds program, we don't know how healthy the ponds are, we're going to wind up overbuilding whatever we have. So it is an important issue to look at. And it's one, frankly, the county has taken a leadership role on for 20 years now, and done really well. And it's a great example of a problem that was only going to be solved regionally because of the nature of watersheds. So are there additional questions around water quality? Questions, comments? Okay, seeing none, we will move on. And thank you very much, Christy. These are excellent. Excellent. The next item on the agenda, number 6, is a discussion of project selection criteria, project outcomes, eligible applicants, and the grant size and scope. And so this comes out of the discussion we had last time about what our deliverables to the commissioners will be and the things they've asked us to take a look at. And we did have some initial discussions about a small grants program, a large grants program, and sort of a mega grant kind of program. I think there was some great feedback from Kristen and Lisa Guyon about the minimum size of some of the grants, even as a small grant. So I think the suggestion is that minimum would be closer to 100,000. So that maybe a small grants program would go from 100 to 250,000, large grants program from 250 to 500,000. So I think at this point, it would be great if as a committee, we could discuss, criteria, outcomes, eligible applicants, and the grant size and scope, so that we might prepare something for a vote at our next meeting. Because we can send these recommendations to the commissioners in an iterative way. And I think maybe getting some money out there on the streets would be an important thing to do. I don't think it requires us necessarily to have ranked the regional challenges at this point, because they could potentially, through the portal, make it available to anyone who wanted to offer or apply for grant money to address any of the 6. I think the prioritization of the regional challenges is really going to be part of the mega grant discussion. So as it relates to criteria, Vera has a spreadsheet that she put together that kind of gives us a sort of a hypothetical step through how we might look, how our suggestions to the commissioners, if this committee does so, would be executed. And so I think for the purposes of this discussion, it might be helpful to have Vera walk through that hypothetical. Vera.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen but I do hope people have it up on their own screens or with them. And I know in the room here, we have hard copies. Bear with me one second. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Good. All right. Here's the 30,000-foot view. This is the overall chart, and obviously I'll zoom in. But the idea here is that various other cross-cutting issues and very important features of projects would be separately scored or considered, and then feed into the core project selection criteria. And so this is a diagram of that sort of thing, showing how that would work, or how that information could flow. Now, specifically to the select, and we've had conversations in previous meetings in which we've brainstormed to some extent project selection criteria. The regional challenges have been set down by the SEDS and Cape Cod Commission SEDS and regional policy plan. So that work was already in place. We've had dialogue about cross-cutting issues and project outcomes. And what I've done is done my best to condense all of the various comments people have made into these sections for onward discussion to identify gaps or maybe modifications that you might want to do. Again, and this is just one approach. So looking more closely at the selection criteria into which the various other elements feed. These are what have come up in the conversation. And if the subsequent steps to this are obviously beyond the diagram, would be then categorizing your size projects. Paul just alluded to those, and then just scoring them. So for priorities, for the meeting ARPA, so row 9, meeting ARPA expectations, you wouldn't necessarily get a score for that. That would have to be a given. And then also secondarily, you wouldn't necessarily get a score for meeting project size and scope criteria. It would also be a given in order to even get in the door. But the remainder of these criteria are, remain, what I think is, important for us to actively discuss. In addition to that, so these are I've added the comments made by various colleagues here with regard to sustainability. So row 16 there, sustainability beyond ARPA would also be modified. In other words, if it's a new project, it would be sustainable beyond ARPA, or if the project's already existing, that it would promote improvement of that existing project. Was a comment someone made. I need to get a comment. One of the criteria that Dan mentioned in here, at the last meeting, I'm sorry, I overlooked it, which is, does the project, do we want a selection criterion having to do with the project asking for capital funding as opposed to operational funding? So that's an additional criterion that we could discuss here. And then I'm still giving us the grand tour, and then I'll step back and we can talk specifics. these regional challenges are as proposed by work that the Cape Cod Commission has done. Cross-cutting issues are these. Access to services is not necessarily only transportation related. It is from a variety of different points of view. Do you have a broadband connection and so on and so forth. But it is also transportation and mobility related. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Other comments that came out in the last meeting had to do with the cross-cutting issue. Do we want to score and recognize projects that are showing use of proven concepts, use of the evidence-based interventions, projects that are demonstrating interagency or intertown or both collaboration? So would you want to differentially score or give a more favorable review to projects like that? Also, is it stimulative? Would a project be stimulative to economic development? And then again, in this typology, you would probably have different criteria and different weightings based upon the size of the project you were considering. If a small project is up to $100,000 or 100,000 to 250, if a large is 250 to 500,000, and a mega project is well above that, your weightings and the sorting of the criteria might well be different, and that is also something that we can discuss. Lastly, project outcomes, very important. We want them to be measurable. The funding has to be spent by 2026. We would want to see sustainability planning beyond that. And I think Lisa raised the issue of explicitly having a return on investment criterion or a project outcome expectation there as well. So that's, and so I'm trying to a little bit of three-dimensional chess here, trying to get the criteria in the categories as well as the project size, and then sort the various priorities, criteria, outcomes, and so on, possibly differentially weight them based upon size would be one particular approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. This has been helpful. Because building on what the commissioners have asked us to do in writing, we look at criteria and outcomes, and you can see from Vera's chart here how those project outcomes, as well as the cross-cutting issues and the regional challenges, are all nested within a set of criteria. Right. And I think that is the way that lays out nicely. As an example, overlying this would be the discussion of eligible applicants and the size and the scope of grants, which potentially would be related. I could see, for example, with a small grant program was open to a number of organizations, entities to respond. And I could see with the large grant program would also include the towns. That, I think Sean brought up a good example. If towns wanted to pursue municipal broadband networks, I think this would be a good grant program that would give them some seed money, sort of analyze that moving forward. So any discussions about eligible applicants or the criteria that Vera has mentioned and talked about this morning? Dorothy.
First of all, I think Vera did an outstanding job capturing all of the fabulous points that each person made and then crafting, this model. I'm so impressed by it, Vera, really. And again, you were so faithful at capturing the discussion and all of the divergent and important points. I guess I had two points, and the second one has to do with eligibility, which I kind of hadn't seen here of applicants, and that was that. But the first one is something we discussed a number of times, and it's really embedded in all of this, but is recognizing the one-time and unprecedented nature of this. So in other words, if this were funds coming from CDBG or something like that, where we knew there's an allocation every year, the decision-making that the commissioners might make could be very different than when they say, this is one bite of the apple. and a significant one for us to have a fairly important impact on these cross-cutting issues. So that I don't know how you captured that, but I do. There's been a lot of very thoughtful observations made about that, and including by the person on my right. So that was one point. The second point in terms of, it really is Kristen and Lisa, and I know she's got her thing today that would comment on this, I think, more, but the eligibility of applicants from the perspective of capacity. So I love the fact that there is the interagency, and I would suggest that it be interagency, intertown, interorganizational collaboration, because it may well not be an agency, could be a coalition of nonprofits, illustratively, but their capability to undertake whatever it is, I think, is an assessment that normally we would include in a grant-making program. We do it ourselves.
Great points. Great points. Thank you, Dorothy. Kristen.
Thanks. Yeah, building off that, I guess, and I apologize if I should know the answer to this and I don't, but can you talk a little bit more about what the application process will look like? I mean, is there an opportunity for this to be iterative, or is it like you're going to get, or whomever is going to be reviewing these is going to get an application, it's going to be reviewed, the end, and move on? Or is there an opportunity for this to be a little bit more proactive, or again, to facilitate those potential partnerships that Dorothy was talking about with a collective of organizations that may not on their own have the capacity, or they have an idea and 3 other organizations have a similar idea and can really leverage and maximize the impact by coming together, but they wouldn't otherwise know that. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's a great observation. So because when we discuss the mega projects, for example, it's unlikely that any one or even several organizations would come in at that appropriate size and scope. And I think on those mega projects, there's an opportunity to get to sort of Dan's initial comments about providing a roadmap on some of these, the top prioritized challenges. But as we consider a smaller and large grant program, I think that your point, Kristen, about maybe getting multiple applications to do a similar thing from different agencies, would we have the opportunity to sort of pool them? I know that happens in some federal grants, as they sort of disperse money. They will look for efficiencies and collaborations. So I think maybe considering that as a potential criteria, or maybe an administrative
It's a
guidance.
process question.
Yeah.
Process question, right.
Do you want to take it, Brenda?
Well, I mean, there's different ways. I mean, how you might deal with it with some of the larger or the mega, if we go down that road. It could be something like a letter of intent, or it could be something on the administrative side where we have a period of time to applications come in, and then we have a period of time to look at them. And if there are similar applications, then to work with the applicants on something joint. I mean, you would rather do it before they submit than after, in my opinion. So I think we need to think through that, but I think there's some tools and mechanisms we can put in place that would allow for that, and encourage that kind of collaboration in the application process.
Yeah, we've been very forward. The towns are now in the process of applying, and we've almost begged them to, talk to us and see, what are you thinking of doing? What, so that we can help at our administrative level, help different applicants, in this case, the towns, find synergies, in what they're doing. So an outreach and communication process to potential bidders prior to them, going into the portal and, putting in numbers and so on would be, I think would be a great way forward. Once you do go into the portal and you apply and you certify your application, then that particular format for that particular application starts its way through the process. You can't modify it after the fact. You can put in another one and we could delete the first one, but that would be a bit of a waste of time. If we could head that off and have these beneficial conversations ahead of time, I think that would be the way forward.
So if we look at the Build Back Better program.
Karen has a-
Oh, Karen.
Oh, no. I don't have a hand because my computer died. I apologize.
Oh, sorry. I see John has his hand. John.
Hi, the work is being done on the house and I'm about to lose power soon, so I'm gonna have to jump a few minutes early. I'm sorry, I would have put that in the chat, but the chat's not available.
Okay,
Yeah.
Leave the chat up.
That's
More chats.
no chats.
okay. So the Build Back Better program,
Oh, that's okay.
do you have?
I just had
Go ahead.
a comment, and it's sort of related to everything that we just talked about in Dorothy's comment, in that I do think that under project outcomes where we say quantifiable benefit, really need some
Yeah.
coaching on impact, and maybe we don't want to put public benefit because that's so open to interpretation. And that
Yeah,
way, we're
sure.
thinking, but
Yeah.
still.
Yeah.
The other thing is related to the more recent conversation is I can't emphasize enough, as somebody that really does a lot of grant writing, how important it is to really lay the foundation of what the county commissioner's priorities are, or what we're recommendation final is, so that by the time someone's sitting down to write a proposal, it's going to be meaningful for meeting our priorities, and they're not wasting time, and we're not, or whoever is not wasting time. That it's a lot of work up front, I know, but really describing the criteria is huge.
Yeah,
So-
Yeah.
So sort of an RFP
Yeah.
conference, which is what the feds do sometimes.
Right, bidders conference.
Bidders
Maybe not for the small ones, but.
Yeah, I could, the Build Back Better program had two steps to it. The first was to apply for a planning grant. So the federal government got all the planning grants in, and where they saw that planning grants were similar, then in the second phase, they encouraged applicants to come together. So I think those are two potential options to get to those points.
And that phased approach is.
Yeah, I
that's
like
a
that.
great idea.
Yeah,
And that's coming about in letters of intent, something to stimulate this kind of pre-conversation
Yeah.
with us that.
great. Kristen?
Yeah, I mean, just again, kind of building on that, I love that idea of doing an LOI or some sort of process like that, because, I know we've had the conversation before about whether our nonprofit partners do have the capacity to handle this level of funding. And we're looking at grants of over $100,000 for the CDBG funding. And it's been, we're picking a smaller group of grantees, but really trying to have broad impact. And it's been a multi-month process to get to the point where, particularly because there are so many regulations with the CDBG funding, that we've got the correct allowable expenses, and, there are projects that are going to have sustainability and impact and all those things. But the way that I see this is we're trying to set the community up for success with these dollars, right? So any opportunities to sort of work with the applicant organizations, whether it's a town or a nonprofit, on if they do have the capacity, and really understanding what that looks like and whether they can handle the reporting and all of that. It definitely takes more time, but I think the outcome in the long run will be much better.
Great. All right, additional comments on item 6. So my suggestion would be, given the way the meeting's gone today, I think we are starting to sort of refine the process and get down to a point where we can make a tangible recommendation or a series of tangible recommendations. And I think the review of the regional challenges, I think Kristen just done an outstanding job at sort of being able to frame that issue and give us something to sort of take with us. So my suggestion would be for our meeting in 2 weeks that we try to cover the remaining 4 regional challenges informationally in one meeting, so that we can get to a discussion around the ranking. My other suggestion is that we come back with something more along the lines of a draft proposal that might go to the commissioners for our review, that covers most of the items in item 6. So I think if we did that, it'll be an aggressive meeting in 2 weeks, but I sense some momentum. I think we're starting to get to a point where we can make some decisions. So any feedback on that suggestions? If not, that's how we'll proceed at the next meeting.
Is Christie still up? Christie is still on.
Yeah,
So the 4 childcare, economic stability, climate change, and infrastructure.
Right.
To see what we have.
is that okay with Christie?
What we.
Cool.
Christie, is that okay with you?
What we have.
Yes,
Is
sure.
that okay?
Sure.
I don't want to be presumptuous around some of these things, but it really is helpful. And you you and your staff do a great job. That's sort of making these issues easier to understand. So, Dan,
Yeah, I hate to be the process wonk because usually I'm not, but have the commissioners or the assembly indicated whether or not we're going to actually be involved on an ongoing basis relative to evaluating and selecting any of this stuff? Or are we sort of just giving this and then we disband?
no, that question came up initially when the commissioners voted to create this committee. And so they left open, they wanted to limit and give us a sort of a finite charge in the mission, but they left open the possibility of a phase 2. So that has been acknowledged and discussed, but right now we're moving to start to give them some recommendations. I don't think they have made a decision about expanding or extending our review, but it's certainly on the table.
Okay,
Great,
thanks.
all right. Unless anyone has anything else to offer, I think we are, she's right at 12:30.
Vote to adjourn.
Dorothy has moved to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Thanks, Dan. We'll take a roll call vote on that. Dorothy Savers,
Aye.
Karen Gardner,
Aye.
Dan Wolf,
Aye.
Sean, I believe, has left us.
Yes.
Okay, Kristen.
Aye.
Okay, thank you all very much. We are adjourned. I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Wait. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? This is Wendy. So I dialed in at noon, so I vote
Wendy.
aye to adjourn.
Oh,
I
thank
couldn't
you,
get
Wendy.
Teams to work, but I'm here, just for the record.
Okay. Thank you very much, Wendy. I know that.
Robin?
Good.
Write it down. 500.
Thank you.
All right, well, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.